Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our open forum, our panel discussion on Syria, chemical weapons, and the international response to the recent crisis in Syria. One of the goals of our Center for Middle East Studies is to provide a forum to discuss contemporary events as they bear on the politics of the Middle East. And looking back, one of the very first things that we did as a center is we organized a conference on Syria. This was back in 2013. And here we are, like 6 years after that event, into the 8th year of the Syrian war, still discussing Syria. And that's simply a reminder of the fact that President Obama's fateful decision in the summer of 2013 to calculate that what happens in Syria will stay in Syria was one of, I think, his biggest foreign policy miscalculations. The conflict in Syria is directly related to the rise of ISIS. It's directly related to the biggest refugee crisis in the last 25 years. It's directly related to the destabilization of the region, and now it's directly related to a global crisis that brings us all here today. So 5, I think, critical questions emerge from recent events related to Syria and the international response to those events. Number 1, and most basically, what exactly is U.S. policy in Syria? President Donald Trump, roughly 2 weeks ago in a speech in Ohio, said that the U.S. would, quote, be coming out of Syria very soon. Now, Trump has presided over a large-scale bombing of chemical weapons production facilities and storage facilities in Syria. So what is Trump's policy in Syria? And more broadly, what is British and French policy in Syria? Is there a strategy? Is there a policy that anyone can discern? Second, beyond responding to Syria's, the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons against Syrian civilians, does Donald Trump, Emmanuel Macron, and Elizabeth May have a plan to protect Syrian civilians in this war that has destroyed much of their country, killed roughly 500,000 people, replete with war crimes and crimes against humanity on a colossal scale? And it's important to point out in the context of recent events and the recent debate with respect to chemical weapons, 99.9% of the 500,000 people killed in Syria have died as a result of conventional weapons, not chemical weapons. And that raises the related question of whatever happened to R2P, the UN principle responsibility to protect that was developed in the context of the aftermath of the genocides in Rwanda and in Bosnia that was aimed to prevent mass atrocities, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, etc. Thirdly, given Trump's newfound interest and concern for Syrian civilian casualties and suffering, will recent events change his views with respect to Syrian refugees and coming into and allowing them to enter the United States? The current policy is effectively to ban Syrian refugees from coming into the United States. Over 100 missiles were fired into Syria over the weekend. 11 Syrian refugees were allowed into the United States in 2018. And fourth, what are the implications for U.S.-Russia relations as a result of recent events? President Trump has been, as you all know, very reluctant to criticize Vladimir Putin, yet on Friday, when he announced the airstrikes, he said, "To Russia, I ask, what kind of nation wants to be associated with mass murder of innocent men, women, and children?" So one of the, I think, themes of recent events that is worth perhaps discussing is the implications that flow from events in Syria with respect to U.S.-Russian relations and the conflict zones that exist across many areas in terms of West-Russia relations going forward. And finally, what about international legality? Critics of the recent airstrikes have pointed out that these strikes were illegal under international law. Some say even illegal under U.S. law. Should the U.S. Congress, should have the British Parliament, the French National Assembly been consulted prior to taking military action against Syria? And so the broader question is, can the recent military strikes be justified according to any international legal norm or precedent? I think those are some of the questions that emerge in my mind with respect to recent events. And to help us answer some of these questions, to interpret, to provide insight, is our very distinguished Korbel panel. Since this is very much an in-house event, most of you know and are familiar with the people on our panel, I will not give them long introductions. Lewis Griffith is the director of our International Security Program, member of the board of the Denver Council on Foreign Relations, formerly associate professor at the Air Command and Staff College from 2007 to 2010. Micheline Ishai teaches courses on political theory and human rights here at the Korbel School. She's the core director of our Political Theory Initiative and was the former director of the International Human Rights Program here at the Korbel School. Gary Grappo is a career diplomat with postings in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Jerusalem, just to name a few. In 2006, he was sworn in as the U.S. ambassador to the Sultanate of Oman, and he's currently a distinguished fellow at our Center for Middle East Studies, where he teaches courses on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. And Tom Ferrer is university professor and dean emeritus. He's a scholar of international law and U.S. foreign policy. He served as the dean of the Josef Korbel School from 1996 to 2010. He's also a contributor to the book that I mentioned. I had a chance to actually reread his fascinating and still relevant essay in the book called Syria, The Case for Staggered Decapitation, which is highly relevant, and I'm hoping Tom might say something about that chapter in the book. If not, I certainly will ask him about it. The format that we agreed upon is the following. I've asked each of the panelists to prepare an introductory statement of roughly 10 to 12 minutes. I will enforce the time fairly strictly so that the program can stay on schedule, but also so that the question and answer session can also take place and we can hear from our audience as well. My role here is that of a moderator, a discussant. I'm hoping that we can have a very useful and fruitful exchange on this important topic that many people thought had really passed away, but as I think we can all see, Syria is very much back on the agenda. And to understand and interpret it, we've put together this forum. So with that as an introduction, let me turn the floor over to Tom Ferrer, who has the next 10 to 12 minutes to share with us his ideas. You want to come to the front, Tom?
Sure. That's Nader. I was going to evade all of the very fine questions that Nader put. But since he did mention international law, let me just say that the attacks on the Syrian regime are a violation of international law. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't have occurred. There is a doctrine of necessity, and sometimes, not often, there's always a presumption in favor of being law-abiding, but there are exceptional circumstances. We can return to that. But if you want to ask me as a conventional international lawyer whether an attack on a recognized government, because remember, we have never de-recognized the government of Syria in all of these 8 years. We could have recognized an alternative regime, but we never chose to. And that's an interesting question as to why we didn't. But since we didn't, and since the government of Syria has not invited us to attack them, or to be present militarily, it seemed to be a violation of the UN Charter. Conversely, the Russian presence and the Iranian presence in Syria is a presence invited by the government of Syria, the legitimate recognized government, barbarous, but legitimate recognized government of Syria, formally speaking, and therefore it's legitimate under international law. The presence, never mind putting aside what they're doing there, all right? But the reason I said I was not going to directly answer the questions raised by Nader is because I think to appreciate where we are now in the jungle that is Syria, we need to see how we got there. So I'm going to do what you said you wanted me to do, Nader, which is to say something about the position I articulated back actually around the very beginning of the conflict. 3 things, arguably 4 things, but at least 3 things have not changed since 2011. One is the conviction of the Assad-led mafia that governs Syria, that any challenge to the status quo, any challenge to its way of governing Syria constitutes an existential threat to it. Conviction one. Second, the conviction of that same mafia that constitutes the legitimate government of Syria, that if you pitilessly murder and torture enough people, any threat to the regime will eventually dissolve. Those were the convictions in 2011. Those are its convictions today. So they haven't changed. Now, what followed logically for President Obama in 2011 from the existence of those two convictions was that unless the U.S. presented Assad with an existential threat to compare with the existential threat that he perceived from the beginning of resistance, first unarmed, then armed, then there was every expectation that Assad would go ahead and murder the population until they stopped resisting or stopped objecting to the basic system of governments in Syria. That was the logic, it seems to me, of the situation in 2011, and it's a logic that has not changed. The third unchanging element of Syrian reality is the Iranian leadership's conviction that it has a vital interest in the survival of Assad's regime. No change. And the fourth element, but one which has changed in degree, but by an order of magnitude, is the Russian interest in preserving its position in Syria. Notice I put it slightly differently. I didn't say preserving Assad or the regime, but its position, which it tends to equate with preserving, if not Assad personally, with the elements of his regime. And those interests really had two dimensions. One, it's one port in the Mediterranean, and two, it has been for decades a principal purchaser of the one manufactured product where the Russians are competitive internationally, which is the production of arms. Those are the two principal interests that the Russians have. But now, as a consequence of all that's happened in the last 7 years, they have other interests, psychological interests, geopolitical interests, which may have been there 8 years ago, but not with the kind of prominence that they have now. In a sense, they've drawn red lines too, though we're not quite sure where those red lines are. Now, if we go back to 2011, what could the Obama administration have done in the face of conservatives, not all conservatives, but many conservatives, who simply washed their hands and said, if some Arabs are killing other Arabs, why should we care? What is our interest in that? None. We have no dogs fighting, and therefore let them kill each other. And then on the liberal side, not all liberals by any means, but those liberals who are instinctively pacifist, who believe that the use of force is presumptively wrong. They have plenty of grounds for thinking that, if you look at all of our adventures over the past 100 years. But rightly or wrongly feel that way about the use of force, resist it viscerally, feel that there must be other ways, diplomacy, discussion, reconciliation. They were concerned. They wanted to prevent the slaughter, but they didn't want to intervene. So they didn't want to accept the logic of what I suggested was the situation, given the convictions of the key actors at the time. So I don't want to take more than my time. I don't even want to take all of my time at this point. What exactly could Obama have done? Because ultimately, I did serve a little time in government, in the State Department at one point, in the Defense Department at another point, not working on these particular issues. And in the end, the question is, what exactly is policy? What are you going to do day to day? What's your step? All right. If I had been advising Obama and Obama had accepted my logic and said, we're not going to let him murder Syrians until the resistance ends, then I would say, do the following. Send the vice president, whom you're clearly close to, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to meet with Assad and the heads of security and the armed forces and say the following. You understand how he feels. You understand his convictions. But for a variety of reasons, the U.S. cannot accept that he slaughter until he restores order. We're not going to accept that. On the other hand, we don't seek regime change because we've had an experience with efforts at regime change. It didn't work out well. So what we want is regime modification, is regime opening, regime relaxation. That's what we want. And if we get that, we will support the opening of the regime, and we will recognize that the only thing that Assad can agree to is a regime in which he and his sectarian group have a veto on policy. Obviously, they'll be taking some risks in going that route, in incorporating other elements of the society into governance. Obviously, they won't be able to plunder as much, but after all, they've done well. They don't have to plunder as much in order to maintain a high standard of living. But they will have our support if they move in this direction. And what if they don't? Well, as I said back in 2012, in the article that ultimately appeared in the book that Nader edited, we propose to serially decapitate you. We won't start with the head of state because we don't want disorder. We might start with your uncle. We might start with the head of security. You don't know whom we'll start with. We haven't even decided whom we'll start with. But we guarantee we'll start. And we'll continue until you agree with us. We would tell the Russians at the time, remember, this is long before Crimea, long before relations with the Russians were as toxic as they are at the present moment, that we don't want to affect your position in Syria. We don't care how many arms you sell to the Syrians. And we certainly don't mind you having a port in the Mediterranean. We have ports all over the place. It's all right. You're a great power. But this is what we're going to do. Work with us to modify the government, because the only way you'll get stability in Syria, and we have a national interest in order and stability in Syria, is for the regime to open, to relax, to bring in other elements. Yes, there'll be irreconcilables. There always are irreconcilables. That, it seems to me, logically was the only move the United States could make. Boots on the ground was not politically possible at that time, much less today. So that's what I would have advised the president. Obviously, he chose a different route, and here we are today. Thank you.
Thank you for the Center for Middle East Study to organize this panel, Gina, for doing always the heavy lifting, and Nader Hashemi as well. I think this is an important topic. Nader Hashemi asked the panelists to talk about two main questions. The first one, he asked us if we really wanted, whether we were supporting the recent US, British, and the French airstrike in Syria. So I'm going to just make a statement, and before I hear, I will develop it. So as a rejoinder to Tom Fowler, I would suggest that even if international law provide insufficient ammunition to justify the Western strike against Syria, Syrian storage sites of chemical weapons. I would argue, for human rights reasons, political reasons, and moral reasons, that an attack, even limited attack, is better than no attack. And I will explain the rationale of how I got to this point. So I won't go through the reason why international law is flawed and does not have the robust strength to actually implement and protect human rights. We know certainly that in the United States, the constitutions vest the power to declare the war to Congress, but the US president have not been overly constrained in their activity with protracted armed conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. So they didn't go that far with that aspect. But with respect to international law, we know that the United Nations charters also recognize the possibility of uses of force on another country's soil without its consent, only for reasons of self-defense and with permissions of the Security Council. And we know that that's not happening as well, because China and the Russians have shown their unwillingness, or actually have registered their veto power. With respect to humanitarian law, we know that there is a violation of Chemical Weapons Convention, but here we don't. This could provide some form of rationale for interventions, but it's not happening as well because the Security Council has to approve as well. So here we're back to the same problem that Tom Farrow was describing. And with respect to R2P, responsibility to protect, R2P, in fact, what is interesting is that the British government has been invoking R2P. Maybe they were not supposed to do that, and you can do it on an exceptional basis in order to alleviate overwhelming humanitarian interventions. And they suggest that there are 3 conditions that are met. Usually R2P can hold. If there is convincing evidence, if the objectives are clear, and that there is no practical alternative, and if the proposed use of force must be necessary and proportionate. So in this sense, we can say that the recent attack followed those mandates, but it did not receive the UN legitimacy. So in principle, yes. In practicality, no. So now we're finding ourselves with, on the one condition, if so, was that attack, as I would try to argue, is justifiable. I'm going to just quote you something that Kofi Annan mentioned in 2000, which I think is very pertinent at then and also today with respect to the limitation of international law. And what he said is that if humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity? Why and how can we do that? We know that many have argued in the US and across the Atlantic after the bombing in Syria, the attack in Syria, that the attack is not justified because there is no broad strategy. And so what? So it's futile. And Bashar al-Assad, many argue, might come actually stronger facing the inconsequential wrath of Western powers after the attack. So what I would like to suggest is that these positions are flowed in 3 ways. First, because inaction would solidify anyway Assad success in regaining control over Syria. So if there was no attack, it's just simply going to keep continuing and regaining the control that he had over Syria. So an attack might not have just changed anything, but it did not create a casualty at the same token. Second, I would like to suggest because there is a possibility of subsequent chemical attack by Assad, that could lead to even more costly attack by 3 major Western powers. Now we have a different scenario that is ongoing. Assad knows that 3 major Western powers have attacked those sites, and now he has to wonder, will I be using it next time around? So there's a fear that has been created that could be used, could be an opportunity, might not be an opportunity, but nonetheless, it's there. And third, however limited this attack, I think that the Western fear of escalation could, not necessarily, but could tilt the balance of power in Syria, creating the possibility for a new round of negotiation. Now, you can tell me this is wishful thinking, you just dream on, it's not going to happen. But it's a possibility that was not on the table before last week's attack. So just think about that, just a possibility. Now, what we do with possibility is a different question, and it's also the second question that now the Hashemis ask us to address, and that is what could be really the mechanism and scenario that address the Syrian tragedy. I do not expect in my few minutes that remain that I will just really provide an answer for that. But I would remind you that there are at least 3 current perspectives in foreign policy regarding an intervention in Syria. Realism, liberalism, and neoconservatism. I know that many of you are students in international study, recognize those perspectives, and I will argue, however, that each of these perspectives, with respect to Syria, is flawed as well. And what I would like to do is entertain a fourth approach, maybe a more human rights perspective, based on historical antecedents. In other words, what I'm trying to advocate here is for a confederal Syrian solution developed after a long interim period, overseen by a 4-power mandate over Syria, powers such as Russia, the US, the UK, and France, that will emulate similar efforts that were established after World War II to consolidate Germany. So that will be sort of the first way to just sort of fill the gap, the vacuum that would be created at this point. So beyond the need of humanitarian assistance, it is worth pointing out that Syria faces actually 3 possible outcomes. 3 types of future, if I more. A continuation of Assad rules, the breakup of the country, or some form of federalism. From a human rights perspective, the survival of Assad's rule would be a disaster. A dissent would be crushed, or as all dissent would be crushed with impunity, and refugees will not be repatriated. In fact, it will perpetuate the humanitarian crisis that currently exists in Europe and destabilize the Middle East. It's not going to change anything. It's actually worsening. So just staying with the status quo will not help in any way. But a second argument that is out there with respect to solutions in Syria is sort of a secessionist argument. It's very a la mode this day. If people cannot get along, so of course let them divorce. But this approach tends to favor sort of more cultural rights over universal rights. And let me just translate what I just said. One problem of that ethnic solution is that it tends to intensify primordial loyalty over real political arrangement. And another problem is that partition will not benefit everyone in the long run. In this case, we will see the minority Alawites would remain in the control of the country's greatest assets, Damascus and the Mediterranean coast, and no doubt aggravating resentment among Sunnis in particular. The separations of people into new territory may appear to be an expedient response to an existential distress, but it's not an enduring political solution in and of itself. So further, I would say that the newly independent state would be weaker and more vulnerable to groups like radical jihadist, ISIS, or whatever new iterations of those groups. So whatever the ultimate political arrangement, what I would like to suggest is that a unified federal or confederal state would always be preferable, as each territories offer particular advantage, ports, access to natural resources, etc. And shared security structures would be to everyone's advantage. Now, how do we get there? Now, we have a mess. This is a maelstrom. We have the Russian, the Iranian, the French, the British, the Kurds. I mean, this is how do we get to that place is a big question, and certainly can take more than the time that I will be talking today. But a first transition toward a unified federal or confederal state, one could envision, again, the establishment of a security architecture calling for and enforcing a moratorium on civil war, either through a negotiated truce or through safe havens. Now, the best historical example that comes to my mind, and I'm sort of always go back to history to look for a solution, is for such approach maybe World War II's Allied Control Council, the ACC, which was headquartered in Berlin, which brought order, safety, and sustenance to the people in the territory liberated from fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The ACC consisted of 4 powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union that occupied Germany after World War II. One could imagine a very similar structures with the same powers in a transitional Syria, in a Syria that will actually try to just first have and invite those 4 possible powers divided in 4 zones, just as it was in Germany, and then reconstruct it before it succeeded reunify once again. So each sphere of influence could be rebuilt, and this would provide a measure of confidence, a stepping stone to the reunification of Syria that is more than just a collection of hostile ethnic groups, but a federal state equitably integrated politically and economically, just as Germany after World War II. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and my thanks as well to both Nader and Gina for organizing this very timely panel discussion. So President Trump, of course, promised that he would attack, and he did. So what did we achieve through these attacks? What were the accomplishments? First of all, we once again demonstrated there will be consequences to the use of chemical weapons, and that's important for the international community. These are banned weapons, and countries who use these should suffer some consequences. You can judge whether these were sufficient. Secondly, there was significant but not complete destruction of the chemical weapons facilities in Syria. I think there was an R&D facility, which is probably a manufacturing facility, and 2 storage facilities. I'm pretty certain there is much more than that. Finally, and something that I think is especially significant, mostly for the United States, is that unlike the attacks last year, this year we were joined by our British and French allies. This is really important for the United States because Donald Trump, during his campaign and during the initial months of his presidency, criticized some of our very best allies, including Britain, by the way. He seemed to like French because they gave him a nice military parade. But this is really important because, the United States, traditionally since World War II, has acted jointly very often in these kinds of operations. But more importantly, it did provide an air of legitimacy, additional air of legitimacy to these attacks. And I think lastly, these attacks demonstrate that the United States, despite where we are in this tragic civil war, is not without leverage. Now, what did we not accomplish by these attacks? Many of his chemical facilities, as I said, were not touched at all. His delivery systems, namely his 250 aircraft Air Force, was untouched. The command and control system in Syria was untouched, and the air defense capability was unaffected by the attacks. We did not go after Assad or the key leadership of his regime, nor did we target either Russians or Iranians, their personnel, or their facilities in Syria. So if you want to draw conclusions from this, if I were Assad, I'd say, okay, this was more than a wrist slap, more like a bloody nose, something he can easily withstand. And whatever calculation he used in making his decision to carry out the attack, the chemical attacks in Douma, were probably correct. And both he and his Russian and Iranian patrons probably are feeling pretty smug right now, since the consequences were fairly modest. Not attacking the Russians and the Iranians was very important, because clearly 1 week ago we faced a great risk of this conflict escalating. It is already an international conflict, and I'll speak a bit more about that in a moment. But this could have really escalated to something much, much bigger had we gone after the Russians, most especially, but the Iranians as well. I also want to make the point that having weathered this attack, I'm fairly confident that he will use chemical weapons again in northwestern Syria, in Idlib. The population of Idlib was, before the civil war, I have no idea what it would be today, was about 1.5 million people. It's now a concentration of a number of opposition groups, including several jihadist groups and groups that we like, some groups even the Turks like, and quite a number of non-combatants who have taken refuge there or have been forcibly relocated there by either the Iranians or the Syrians. And finally, without any doubt, the balance of forces in Syria still lie with Assad, Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and the several Shia militia groups who are fighting on behalf of Assad there. So as I said, this is no longer just a civil war, as tragic as it is. It is an international conflict. Just a question, depending on when you look at it, how serious it is or could become. We certainly see the United States and Russian forces aligned against one another. We also have the United States confronting Turkey, a NATO ally, or a fellow founding member of NATO. This is over the presence of the SDF, which are largely Syrian Democratic Forces, which are largely comprised of Syrian Kurds, very close to the Turkish border. We also have the very real possibility of a confrontation between Iran and Israel. We've already had one, which was fairly easily addressed, but I think it shocked a lot of people. This is when the Syrians/Iranians sent a drone, which now the Israelis are claiming was an armed drone, into Israel. It was shot down. In the process, the Israelis also lost an aircraft. And now they've been in a verbal joust about potentially escalating that conflict. Please understand, those of you who probably understand Israeli politics will understand this. The Israelis are playing with a very tiny buffer, and they will not allow the Iranians to move within a certain distance. We don't know quite what that is. I'm guessing it's 20 to 30 kilometers, maybe longer, within the Israeli border, and they'll respond. Doesn't matter who's there, including, by the way, the Russians, though I think the Russians understand it much better than the Iranians. And then this conflict also is a reflection of the greater conflict between Sunni Arabs and Shia in the Middle East. Now, Trump has been accused of not having a strategy. No, he's got one. It's just the one most people don't like. And it's certainly not one that most Americans and most of our allies are familiar with if you look at the long tradition of U.S. foreign policy, not only in that region, but around the world. And in some ways, it's very similar to his predecessor's policy, Barack Obama. First of all, this is not our fight. We do not want to get engaged in a long-term conflict. His sole focus is eliminating ISIS, and we're just about there. And he said just before the chemical attacks and days before we launched the strikes against his facilities, that we were going to withdraw all our troops from the northeastern part of Syria, where they work with the Syrian Democratic Forces. Unlike President Obama, he has no grand or noble goals. We just don't want to be a part of that fight. This is not a place for the United States to be, and they're going to have to settle it themselves. Doesn't express any hopes, any aspirations, just stay out. Thirdly, he's not in the business any longer of promoting human rights or democracy or nation building. If someone wants to do that, he would probably say, go ahead. But the United States is out of that business, most especially in Syria. Also, and this is difficult for the United States, and it must be somewhat shocking for our allies around the world. In his view, the United States has no responsibility for this conflict or its victims. That includes the refugees, which is why, as was mentioned earlier, we've taken so few of Syrian refugees. And he has no trust or faith in the traditional approach of U.S. foreign policy or national security policy. That is, alliance building, working with our allies, convening our allies, and trying to address collectively these challenges, whether in the Middle East or elsewhere. The internationalist approach with the United States, which the United States has led since the end of World War II, is no longer part of U.S. strategy, at least as articulated by the president. And finally, his solution is let the region deal with its own problems. You may have read recently that there's an effort afoot, presumably to get other Arab countries to dispatch troops to Syria once the United States withdraws. This isn't the first time this idea has been considered. I don't think it's going to go very far, because most of the Arab governments who could send forces there have got problems of their own at home, including dealing with some pretty nasty extremist groups inside their borders. So if you kind of look at this, President Obama, who didn't say a policy as harshly as I've just outlined, was trying to offer what is effectively a false hope for Syrian people. The United States was not going to get involved under Barack Obama, and we didn't. And Donald Trump is making very clear it's not a question of false hope. There's no hope, at least if you're looking to the United States. It's going to have to be the Syrian people or the forces present in Syria, or it will have to be some international Arab force. But it's not going to be the United States. And I will conclude by saying the president described this region as a troubled region. For anybody who spent any time there, it's pretty obvious. But what I think Syria shows us is that a troubled region, unaddressed, creates troubles in other parts of the world, including in the region. Look at Jordan, especially look at Lebanon and Turkey, but also look at Europe, and perhaps spreading further from there. We're living in a world where leaving troubled regions to themselves may not be sufficient to resolving these troubles.
Going last after your really bright colleagues is either a burden or a curse. It's never a blessing, because now you have to decide what you thought you'd say that they haven't said better than you have. So let me see what I can do. Basically, let me start by saying the problem in Syria is it's a problem, meaning I can pick almost any level of analysis, and as my colleagues have already laid out, I can find something to talk about. And I can stratify that all the way down from where we started, which is the conversation about international law, R2P, humanitarian intervention, what states should be allowed to do to their own citizens, etc. Or I can walk it all the way down to where Obama and Trump ended up. It's about terrorist threats to the United States. It's worth remembering the first airstrike authorized by the Obama administration was against a group that had nothing to do with either ISIS or Syria, but a group that happened to be co-located in Syria, the Kobani group that was working in European networks to attack Western targets. It was not a coincidence. We found Obama frustrating because his rhetoric and his general multilateralist positions sounded like he should take a higher level order of problems, sounded like he would understand it in multilateral, humanitarian, or some other sort of regional dynamic. And we were frustrated because he chose to isolate it to terrorism, and then upon prompting and some interesting articulations on his own administration's part, to add chemical weapons to the mix. As Ambassador Grappo has just laid out, we don't find that as surprising or frustrating with Trump because we're not surprised to find that he's taken a lowest common denominator definition of the problem in Syria. And he's defined it in exactly the same way. He's defined it as terrorist threats to the United States, and in first, I think, in response to Obama's inability to take action, and now I think it is a personal affront that his failure, that his desire to take action previously has not resulted in the proper amount of credibility. So then the question becomes, as Dr. Hashmi asked us, do you support the airstrikes? Do you support these sorts of actions if you understand the problem the way Obama and Trump do? Groups sufficiently capable enough of taking action against Western targets on terrorist front, and some sort of instinctive, maybe in Trump's case, or fundamental objection to rewarding the use of chemical weapons. So to cut to the chase on that point, I do. I do think a multilateral response to the use of chemical weapons is an appropriate bounding exercise in establishing some sense of where America's lines are, and they're clearly not red, but America's lines are, and what a multilateral response might look like. But of course, that's not really the bigger question. The bigger question is, what should the problem of Syria be understood as? Where should we be drawing that contextual analysis? Because the current policy in Syria, which has been an intervention policy, I don't want to nitpick, but we sometimes say the debate is about whether we should intervene in Syria. We have intervened in Syria. We have intervened in Syria with about 2,000 troops and about 10,000 American military personnel on permanent Syria duty, be that air, sea, space, intel, etc. There's a sizable but not meaningful in the DoD universe sense a group of people on Syria as a combat activity right now. But their ROE, their mission, their structure is all basically on the assumption that their primary purpose is the elimination of terrorist threats beyond the borders of Syria. They're not there for any other particular reason. So we are stuck with an intervention that makes us look like we are participating in a whole array of problems that this room cares about deeply that we frankly don't care about. So one of two things is possible then, right? I have a lot of military colleagues who would then tell you, this is how we should have done Afghanistan. We're only worried about the things we're worried about. We're only worried about the things we can achieve in our own security. This is a positive. There's only one small problem with this. Almost every aspect of this policy has been a strategic failure. The fact that we are involved but somewhat impotent on all the larger questions has basically just demonstrated to almost everyone who does strategic studies that this operation, this intervention light, whatever you want to call it, lacks, credibility, deterrence, influence, norm and rule enforcement, effectiveness, relations with allies until very, very recently, which might be a positive. I agree with Ambassador Grappo on that. And its single-minded focus on ISIS, which I, by the way, think makes a great deal of sense in Iraq, simply looks small time in the context of Syria. So no, the current policy in Syria to address the problem as defined simply as terrorism has had no larger geostrategic benefits whatsoever. And since it's an open question on its effectiveness with terrorism, it cannot be hailed as a success, even if we all agree, and I think we kind of do as a panel, that the chemical attacks themselves that brought us all here to talk about this specifically this evening were probably still a good idea. So you're going to ask me the obvious question. So what should we do now? Should we, in fact, take this as the first step to correcting this failure? We should up the ante. We should be more involved. We should correct all of these weaknesses that we have displayed through this very limited understanding of the Syria problem and the very limited efforts that have gone with it. I want to say yes. The answer is no. The answer, sadly, is, and I hate the Vietnam-Syria analogy because they really are not particularly analogous cases. But for those of you in the room who get the analogy in its broadest sense, folks, it's 1973. We are effectively left coercing people to set the terms of our departure, or disinterest, or failure to escalate. We are bombing people with the always fine-tuned tool of air power coercive diplomacy so that they don't do anything truly hideous that would force us to stick around any longer than we want to. We had a chance to make Syria, if not a success, then at least something the United States would have benefited from geostrategically. That moment has gone, and we are playing defense. I support a defense that includes you will not chemical munition your people in large numbers, and I'm unconcerned about the international legalities. But if you think the answer is to go up the ladder of escalation or scale, I don't see a good outcome for any involved. Thank you.
Okay, I have one question for each of our panelists, and I'll ask them to provide short answers, hopefully, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So, Tom, that was a very good sort of retrospective in terms of what President Obama should have done when he had the options, more options available to him. What about now? What about, let's say hypothetically, we get a administration in the White House that is somewhat concerned about these issues in a serious way in 2020, let's say. What options can or should the U.S. pursue with respect to Syria, given the existing reality of the conflict as we know it today? For Micheline, you made an argument for supporting the recent strikes based on moral grounds, based on a human rights argument, invoking the R2P principles. But if you look at actually what was accomplished and what I mentioned in my introductory remarks, that 99.9% of the human suffering in Syria has nothing to do with chemical weapons. It's overwhelmingly conventional weapons. I would argue that the message that was sent by these recent airstrikes to Bashar al-Assad is the following. You can continue to commit war crimes, you can continue to commit crimes against humanity, just don't use chemical weapons or else that might invoke a response. That's the message. And that's exactly what he's been doing. So in that sense, how has, if you interpret the recent events in a similar way, then in what way can one argue that this recent military strike really had anything to do with alleviating the human suffering in Syria, given those figures of conventional weapons being responsible for most of the overwhelmingly the 500,000 deaths in that country? And for Gary Grappo, a question about long-term strategy that's related to the question of ISIS. ISIS emerges in Iraq and then in Syria, exploiting the theme of Sunni marginalization and Sunni alienation in Iraq and then in Syria. As Bashar al-Assad consolidates his power and as Iran entrenches itself in Syria, that creates the perfect set of conditions for the emergence of ISIS 2.0. Exploiting the exact same themes that produced ISIS to begin with. So we're going to be back to where we started in a few years, given the trends that are in place right now. Most of the Syrian refugees are not going to go back. There's nothing to go back to. And if anything, many of the young Syrian refugees, vast majority of them being Sunni, are going to be very susceptible to the appeals of radical Islamic jihadism, whether it's ISIS 2.0 or some other iteration of that. Back again to where we are. The question really is there, or why is there no long-term sort of strategy or thinking about this particular problem? It seems to be very short-term and very narrow, without any longer-term strategy for the Middle East, Syria in particular. And finally, for Lewis Griffith, a question about Syria's strategy and Hillary Clinton. Hillary didn't talk about a serious strategy during the election because it was not a popular theme, but she did have a plan to create a no-fly zone. she did talk about trying to insert the U.S. in the conflict in Syria in some way that would push back against the Russian and Iranian position and perhaps create better circumstances for serious negotiations. Was that an option? What do you think of that? Was there a realistic plan? I mean, she almost came into office, and let's say she did. Everything that I've heard from people following that particular story is that she did want to insert the United States in a robust way that's very different from what Obama did and very different from what Trump is doing right now. So thoughts on that, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Tom?
Well, that's of course the question. Is this working?
Yes.
Yeah. One would love to evade because that's the most difficult question. I think it depends on two things. One, what are our allies in the Middle East prepared to do? Who are they? The Saudis, the Emirates, the Egyptians. We're not talking about necessarily attractive regimes. I'm just talking about countries with which we cooperate. And above all, the Turks. Now, what do they want? And what do we want? And that takes us to Lewis's point. In deciding where we are and what we should do, we have to sit back and say, what is it we want to accomplish? What serves the national interest? Well, the national interest is like history. We make of it what we want to. What is our conception of the national interest, and then what plausibly connects certain initiatives with that national interest? I'm a great critic of Henry Kissinger. I despise the man. To be positioned modestly. But there is something to be said for the concept of credibility in world affairs. And I think that there has been a substantial loss of U.S. credibility over the past 10 years. You could say 20 years, because we lost credibility by the several $1 trillion we spend in Afghanistan and Iraq. We've also lost credibility during the Obama period by not being prepared and ostentatiously being unprepared to use the still dominant military resources that we possess. So I would say one of our interests, it's not a paramount interest, but it's an interest that needs to be taken into account, is our credibility worldwide. And in that sense, you can't entirely isolate the Middle East from our interests in other parts of the world. And that's not written in some holy book. That's an hypothesis, which you can accept or reject as a plausible hypothesis. Secondly, there's the question of the terrorism. We want to destroy terrorist groups. Why? Because certain of them want to wage war against the West in the West? Well, that's certainly a reason to resist terrorist groups and try to destroy them. But would a policy of withdrawing from the Middle East make us less of a target for terrorist groups? And then the question is, what does withdrawal mean? Are we going to terminate our relationship, our guarantee of Israel? That's part of withdrawing. Are we going to suspend our privileged relationship with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia? The answer to that is no. So in effect, that's not a strategic option presently available to us. Therefore, we can't deal with the terrorism problem by withdrawing from the Middle East, because we're not withdrawing from the Middle East. We're just not exercising all the power that we possess. So, what are the real options? Should we try to play, does it serve U.S. credibility to be in a position to influence the future of Syria? Yes, I think the answer to that is it does. How do we do that? We, or the Turks, or groups that respond to Qatar or to Saudi Arabia are present and control small but not totally inconsequential parts of Syria now. I would say what we have, and that includes Raqqa, what we have we should maintain. But we're not going to put our own boots on the ground. Therefore, to maintain them, we have to have other troops there. Are the Turks prepared to put the troops there? Well, that depends upon how we deal with the Kurdish issue. Well, we've sold the Kurds out several times in the last 50 years. Why not again? For me, the answer is, well, that also affects your credibility as an ally, as a patron of groups. But if we could get certain guarantees from the Turks about, and get the Kurds also to meet the minimum requirements of the Turks, then I think we could get the Turks to occupy parts of Syria. And we want also the Gulf states to occupy part of Syria or support mercenary forces to occupy parts of Syria. And then provide, we'd have to, of course, provide them with air cover intelligence so they can effectively occupy those areas. I would support that. That's not all I would do, but I think that at least is one element of what I would do.
Okay, thanks. Micheline?
I certainly cannot claim with certainty that a strike against Syrian chemical weapons or storage of chemical weapons would have any impact whatsoever. But I know something with certitude is that without that attack we would not be here today, and neither would not have convened this panel. And that only suggests to me that this is in and of itself enough for us to have this conversation. So I'm starting with this first premise. The second premise would be, well, something has happened. It's not just the United States launching, an attack against Syria. It is three great major powers. It's the United States, France, and England. And that doesn't happen often. And that, if I was Assad, I would think twice. Even if it didn't, was limited. I would just wonder why those three powers are ready. They don't like each other. They don't like Trump. They don't like Trump foreign policy. They don't like about climate accord. Now those three powers coordinate effectively the military operation in order to come here and to tell us something. So maybe it's limited, maybe they'll go, maybe it will strengthen Assad power, maybe nothing will happen of it, but I'm just wondering now. And I have to say, if I'm Assad, I'm wondering now. You should be wondering yourself too, because if I do it again, maybe it's not conventional, maybe it's more compared to all the conventional, but I'm still wondering, I do it again, it's gonna hit me again. Idlib or other place, they might do that. And what I'm concerned as now Russia, I am really concerned that now Theresa May and Macron and Trump are getting along. This is fantastic. Russia, Putin, just see that in front of his face, So now there are certain things that are steering the pot. You might just say it's nothing, it doesn't, I don't know, I don't have the crystal ball and you might be right, but we are asking the question and it's important. And I always, it's probably part of my methodological training, if there is opportunity, I want to see how far we can go with those opportunities. Could we open renegotiations? What do that happen? Are we tilting the balance of power? Because after all, the Iranians are not so strong and the Russians are stretching thin in Syria. And they know. Technologically, they are looking really, they're dwarfing compared to great powers' efforts. And the attack was very precise, but showed a lot of technological superiority of the West. So I just want to suggest that there are discussions, and maybe we don't hear it because we're not privy to those conversations, but if I were part of the general, whether it's Russian or Iranian, I would be asking questions. I have 20 scenarios in front of my board, and I just wonder if A happens, then B, and if C happens, then D. So here's the beginning of interesting conversation. We were in a stalemate. We had agreed that Assad has won the day. He was regaining, he was controlling, once again, Syria. That's what we had agreed. I mean, we just look at the other way. We said it's terrible. Half millions of, 500 million. How many millions of Syrian refugees? I've stopped counting. 5 millions of refugees have been killed. Many more displaced. Nobody cares. It's not our problem. But now it's suddenly, wait a second. Maybe we. Oh no, the Israelis are there because they don't like the Iranian. Just now and I like each other. But the Israeli and the Iranians don't like each other. They put more buffer zones with each other. I mean, come on, there are a lot of more conversations ongoing. This is interesting. Just let's not say it's so small, and let's look just as what happened rather than the potential rippling effect that could happen. And as student and as scholar who actually interpret what we are seeing, we can also change it by the very way we interpret it. So if we could push forward. We have 4 or 5 powers in Syria. Well, they need to negotiate. They gotta negotiate. They don't need to sit down and negotiate just as they did after World War II. I don't want to deal with how we defeat Assad. I don't know. I'm not a military. I don't care about how we do it. And part of the major problem, and I found it over and over again, is that all the conversations about the defeat of Assad always stop. And the reason it stops is because people do not know what to do the day after. They say, oh my God, we create a vacuum, and who is going to fill the vacuum? And we're going to create another jihadists are going to come, and who's Shamabika, and Al-Qaeda Mesopotamia, and ISIS, another iteration, another version, and everybody, and the conversation ends. And the one thing as scholars and as students and people are interested in the question that we don't do is precisely ask the question, what are the political possibility and solution should there be a defeat of a gentleman who is not just brutal but also extremely weak. So just leave it.
Gary?
I will reluctantly take on the question you posed about the sectarian conflict, Nader. We do actually have a couple of examples in the history of the region where Sunni and Shia and other elements have managed to come to some understanding. Many of you will remember the Lebanese Civil War. That war went on for 15 years, so we're not even at the halfway point if we judge by Lebanon. And we also have the American experience in Iraq. In both cases, it wasn't some magic peacemaker or magic formula. No St. Francis of Assisi or Gandhi. We didn't even have Jimmy Carter. What it was is sheer fatigue, overwhelming fatigue with the death and destruction that the conflict had wrought in those two countries. And the sides coming together and saying, we just have to stop this. They didn't really settle their differences, but they did stop fighting in both cases. The Shia and Sunni in Iraq, the United States had played some role in that, and the Sunni Shia and the Christians in Lebanon. And so I'm not sure there is any magic formula other than the sides finally accepting the fact on country-by-country basis, whether it's Syria and its variant of the sectarianism we see throughout the region, or it's Libya in its sort of tribal variant of this, or what we see playing out in the Sinai or in Yemen, and sort of between Saudi Arabia and Iran right now, is that the sides finally reconcile themselves to the fact that hating one another is not going to get them anywhere, except more people dying. But I can assure you it will not be the West who will solve that problem for them. We didn't do it in Iraq. It was they who did it, and then we came in with the support that they needed to make it happen. We didn't have the formula. We didn't know how to do it. But they somehow managed to do it. And so I suppose my answer would be, Nader, is that when the sides resolve that the fighting and the hatred that spawns the fighting it reaches a certain point, then maybe they'll stop. And then we can play a very helpful and supportive role. But we won't fix the sectarian problem.
Okay. Thanks. So, Louis, did Hillary Clinton have any military options that could have perhaps affected the outcome of where we are today?
It's very kind of you to give me the counterfactual. I can't get this wrong. I think the fundamental difference between Clinton and Trump at the highest level was actually the most important one. They have a fundamentally different view of Russia. Hillary Clinton, for right or for wrong, thinks Putin is mostly playing a bluff. She very much subscribes to, and her foreign policy team subscribes to the notion that he's got a weak hand, that he's playing brilliantly. And that what needs to happen with Putin, she was very clear on this in the campaign trail, lo and behold, why might the Russians want to have prevented her election? I don't think it had anything to do with disrupting domestic politics. I think it had everything to do with it. Hillary Clinton's been on record since she was Senator Hillary Clinton, first term Senator Hillary Clinton, that the Russians are, that we cater too much to Russian senses of self, that the Russian expansionism is almost entirely defensive, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So to answer your specific question, a Hillary Clinton who comes into office and who is willing to run a diplomatic, I don't think a military, let me be very clear on that, but a diplomatic and political escalation ladder vis-a-vis the Russians to see where they would draw lines is an entirely different one than a Donald Trump who comes in for whatever reason with the starting point of Russia's misunderstood, I can deal with strong individuals, and I have this sort of inherent sense that we could split the world up and cut it down with American maintenance costs. I mean, so we even if we ignore all the potential political ramifications and domestic ones, Trump clearly sees strong leadership as a way to get them to run their parts of the world so that he doesn't have to get involved in those parts of the world. And yes, they're totally 180 out. Since you nicely gave me the counterfactual, though, let me try to build on Micheline's very hopeful diagnosis. Let me explain what would happen, I think, for me to be wrong, and this not be 1973, and there's really all we can do is set bounds for our withdrawal. The first thing we have to do is not withdraw. So the first thing we have to do is our president has to take Assad's most recent action, the chemical weapons attack, and the retaliation, and Assad's, I think, entirely bluff arrogance that he's not worried about American weapons, and the Russians' blatant lie that they shot some down as an affront. We need Trump to get offended. We all are now counting on Trump's ego. That's what I said. So we need Trump's ego to kick in and go, no, 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 I'm not leaving Syria. I want to have some say in the outcome in Syria. These guys are not going to win. Because it would open the door for the conversation Micheline wants to have with allies, that if we believe Trump is now in fact committed to Western influence in the outcome in Syria, it would change the dynamic. Because the biggest problem is neither Putin nor Assad believe that. And if they don't believe it, then as much as I actually want Micheline to be right, I'm afraid there's no leverage points. There's no coercive ability, even in a diplomatic sense. It's simply a waiting game.
Stormy might help.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thank you. Let's turn the floor over to the audience. Sammy, go ahead.
So I'm kind of curious. When you consider some of the reports that came out this morning from some Israeli officials, basically speaking out against Trump for telling all the parties involved in Syria what we were going to do and when we were going to do it, that may be why these strikes might be largely ineffective, and that this was more of a political move to maintain a specific political image or posture. So I guess I would ask how serious our allies should take us and how serious our non-allies should take us in the region based on that. And then I would just ask if these recent strikes have really done anything to change the fact that all the parties that have been involved refuse to meet with each other in any of the peace talks that have been held, and if the situation should go as if Dr. Micheline said, I'm really kind of curious how the initial climate change situation, the drought that sort of led to the population moves that fed into the civil unrest during the Arab Spring in Syria, how do you mitigate that part if they are able to come to some sort of political cooperation?
Those are three questions there. In the future, please ask one question, and I'll leave it to the panel to take any of those three questions and answer them, and then we'll
I'll briefly take the first one.
Okay, go ahead.
So Sammy, yes, this is part of the, and it's back to the conversation we were just having about credibility. The decision was clearly made by the United States, and I have reason to think, but I'm not super well informed enough to tell you for sure, that we were the party most concerned about a Russian provocation. We currently take Putin's rhetoric about chaos, escalation, I might be provoked, more seriously than we would have under Hillary Clinton, for starters. So yes, we did give them notice. Those facilities were probably empty of personnel. We have no reason to think the casualty counts have been conspicuously absent, because I don't think there were any. So in a sense of, if nothing were to change, to Dr. Ashay's point about this would have to start a spiral of events. At the moment, all they did was demonstrate Trump's disapproval with the French and the British, which again I don't mean to mitigate, a multilateral Western disapproval of your use of chemical weapons, and there will be consequences. But those consequences were, as you look at the airstrikes and how they played out, when you look at what was used and what wasn't, the only concern we had that was different is we were prepared. And I believe if you look at the packages, and I won't bore people who don't care with what was used where, on whom, but if you look at the packages, we were prepared for the Russians to defend Syria, and we were prepared to execute the strikes anyway. I think that's the one message we sent the Russians, is that your presence isn't sufficient. The same thing with taking on the Russian mercenaries. But it's a very, I mean, we're baby steppy in this, because we did tell the Russians, we clearly told the Russians, who told the Syrians, to keep casualty counts of human beings on the other side down and destroy facilities. And that's clearly what happened.
Okay, let's take another question here at the front. You had your hand up?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So I was going to ask our panelists about, So a few days ago, I was in a talk with the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and he was discussing how Russia had shut down his effort to discuss chemical attacks in Syria at the Security Council. So I think my question is, how do you see this conversation we're having about legality, accountability, the righteousness of an attack, given the fact that the international system that we have created to prevent this has failed? A side comment, if I may, for Michel. I think you had me until you said day after, and this sort of question about day after, because I think a lot of these discussions on Syria tend to exclude Syrians, who bring to the table a lot of expertise about who and what would come day after. And I think denying that agency that they might have creates this narrative that Assad loves to say, I am the stability that you have in the region because Syrians don't have a game plan for the day after.
Michelle, you want to answer that?
Yes, sure. There is obviously a difference between legality and righteous positions, morality versus legality. I think you understand it very well, so I'm not going to develop that. As with respect to the day after, the notions of agency, yes, of course, you would have to pull the will of the Syrians the day after. But having said that, the Germans after World War II need MacArthur. They need the foreign powers to come and to rebuild a country that has been completely devastated by the war. And so the day after, as much as it requires agency, it also requires the infrastructure to express that agency. So I would not just sort of say one at the expense of the other. When you are in a place of devastations, of war devastations, you want to make sure that powers take the responsibility to restore their zone of influence, just as it was done in Germany. Now, people could say and can criticize, and I have not seen anyone criticize it, so I will criticize my point, could say that, there was a blockade. Well, it was a blockade, and it didn't work as a result of the blockade of the Cold War, that the four zone of the four powers didn't. But I will respond to my own criticism, which should have been given, and suggest the following, is that we began to restabilize Germany. We created 4 zones, and then after the Cold War, we moved to 2, East and West Germany, and after 1989, 1 Germany. So the process that I'm trying to bring into your attention is that it is important to actually look at a variety of steps to create confidence for stability in your architectures of negotiations there is no Syria as we know it in 2011, in 2010. There is no such a Syria. I remember having a Syrian teacher who would, during the 2011 Arab uprising, and I was living in the United Arab Emirates, would tell me, there will be no Arab uprising in the in Syria. And I said, why wouldn't there be one? And she said, because we all love Assad. And then I would ask her, how do you know? And she would respond, because we do. I said, but there is no election. How are you sure? Now, 3 weeks later, on March 25, there was a day of rage in Syria. Now, that
Representative sample there.
represent in a sense that, well, she was sort of Sunni, living in Latakia. But okay, the point that I'm trying to make here is to suggest that the type of Syria that you're referring to, the Syria of the agency of people who actually can express their will without the fear of bombing, with sort of in normal schools without sarin gas or chlorine gas, is not existing right now. So yes, a certain form of a system. You can call it paternalistic, or you can, imperialistic, all the words. But at this point, I really think that the Syrians themselves would very much welcome those type of humanitarian assistance. Not forever, but for a period of time that enables them to lift themselves to a level of dignity and human rights that they're missing.
Rizwan?
Thank you for an excellent panel. We have learned a lot. So there is this narrative that the US should do something on the basis of the moral standards, human rights concern, the people are suffering there. But I'm afraid there's a double standard in this, because there are 5 million refugees of Syria, and not 5 families are allowed in the United States. There's still active travel ban in Syria. Yes, there is this thing, okay, Assad might think, oh my God, I mean, the US is attacking us, but then again, Putin may call Assad and say, have a look at this, your people are dying, and do you think they're caring for your people? They're not taking any of refugee from your side. And also what Professor Griffith was saying about Trump's ego, given his international prestige, given his international image about his regard for human rights and human beings, how do you think that even if he is involved in this, how will it have an effect on the Syrian people and on the region as a whole?
So the question is about Trump?
This administration.
Yeah. So could you re-articulate the question, because I'm not sure what exactly you're asking?
The trustworthiness of this regime's or this administration's rhetoric that it is working for human rights.
Yeah.
How would Trump's ego translate into something that took care of Syrians?
And they never articulated a position on human rights.
Right,
And they won't.
absolutely.
They will not. It's just not, it doesn't exist. It's a blank page. And don't expect one.
I'd like to try the devil advocate. Not that I believe
Okay,
what I
go
say.
ahead. Yeah.
I just for the entertainment, perhaps at this point in time. He has a lot of domestic problems. I don't trust at all the Trump administration in its foreign policy, and I'm like you, very concerned that it can actually fulfill the promises that we were hoping that he might fulfill should there be opportunity that are provided. However, he has a lot of problem at home, a lot of problem. And yes, he would want to deflect it. But the interesting part is that he wants to deflect those problems, but he's not alone. And there are other partners who are a little bit more cautious than he is, the French and the British, who have a vast interest in the Middle East and vast interested in the refugees question. So maybe it is a leap of faith. They are hoping that problems at home will actually compel him to do something good, because he has no other form of recognition elsewhere. And so I'm just trying it out, just as a devil advocate position. You can embrace it or not. And as I said, and it's not completely fascist, that maybe Desert Stormy is the trick of the trick.
Okay, Ahmed?
I have a very simple question. How Yemen is different from Syria? And I don't really, it's not my intention to distract the discussion from Syria to Yemen, but Yemen is still the Middle East. And given all the norms that you have analyzed today, international relations, international law, sovereignties, proxy wars, even human rights violations, I don't see Yemen is much different from Syria. It's just a new Syria. However, Yemen is receiving less attention, not just politically and diplomatically, but even academically and scholarly. So my question is, what's your take on what's going on in Yemen, which again I claim is not much different from Syria?
So the same arguments, one would argue, apply to the case of Yemen.
Yes and no.
Why no?
And I agree with you, Yemen is a horribly ignored tragedy as well. So I'm not trying to equate, I'm not trying to minimize Yemen. But we're going to start with the basics of, strategic analysis. Geography. Where is Syria vis-a-vis the other major centers of the Middle East? Where is Syria vis-a-vis Israel? Where is Syria vis-a-vis Russian interests? Yemen is a tragedy that's taking place on the periphery of the Arabian Peninsula, in which the major intervening parties are Saudi Arabia and UAE, and in which I think terrorist groups may move there to make relevant, but from which we don't have an ISIS. So from a strictly selfish, and I don't share this view entirely, I'm answering your question, I'm not necessarily happy about the answer. But if I'm doing a geostrategic analysis, simply in terms of things that threaten the United States' long-term interests, and things that don't, as much as I think the tragedies are similar, I don't think the threats emanating beyond their borders are yet anywhere near similar. Could get there, yes, which would be bad for Yemen, but not there yet.
Yemen is another case where the humanitarian situation and certainly the condition with regard to human rights is simply not on the radar for the United States. It's another clear indication to me of the president's very arm-length approach to dealing with the Middle East. He's more than happy, in the case of Yemen, to provide all the weapons the Saudis and the Emiratis need to level that country, although not solve the problem and not get involved. And if there were someone in Syria doing what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen, he would arm them to the teeth as well. But there isn't.
He asked him to do it yesterday, didn't he?
Yeah, but they're not stepping up. And so his approach to the Middle East is, we're not getting involved. We think you should settle the problem, and we'll be more than happy to sell you the weapons to do it. And that's the extent of it. Unless there's an ISIS involved, or similar extremist group, or crosses this line, and why he feels this unique sympathy for Syrians dying as a result of chemical attacks and not dying as a result of barrel bomb attacks. I'm unclear, but that's his line. Those are the only two conditions where he'll actually dispatch U.S. forces.
Did you want to say something?
Just, but maybe just a footnote, as Syria was under French mandate until Léon Blum, so strong relationship that existed then and continued to exist as a result. Russia, the borders very close. We have Iran's attempting to have its access, Israelis in the border, sort of going back a little bit to what Louis said, access to the Mediterranean, capacity to move forward very fast. So Syria, high level of human capital compared to Yemen. Now, the one thing that Yemen is coveted for, it's its choke point. Everybody wants to actually go through the choke of Mandelbeb, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. and so we have, on the one hand, the Saudi and the Iranians really fighting in order to make sure that they have control of those straits. And that's about it, because anything else, when you think there's utter poverty, Yemen, really poverty, lower level human capital, Yemen should be of no interest but for Al-Qaeda Mesopotamia, who is nestled just sort of in the middle of Yemen. And so, but Syria, geopolitically speaking, I think it's more geopolitical, has more points of entry and more points of access, and then it goes to the Mediterranean. Everybody, wants to have that access to the Mediterranean. So perhaps that is the reason of why there is slightly more interest in Syria versus Yemen.
Okay, let's take 3 more questions and then we'll try and wrap it up. 1, 2. Is there a third question? 3. Go ahead. Yeah, at the back.
So this is a question primarily for Micheline, but relates to what Professor Griffith was saying. But your idea to create a sort of confederation among Syria reminds me a lot of what the Dayton Accords did in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And while that might sound good, the issue is that to get to the Dayton Accords, we had to punitively bomb Yugoslavia and Serbia to get there. And we haven't done that in Syria, and unless all of a sudden we're planning to bomb Damascus, like what's kind of the in-between to get there?
No, I think you're right. The analogy is it's a perfect analogy. Well, under Tito, Yugoslavia was a confederation, and then the effort to, after the Dayton agreements, to just bring it back together, but sort of more fragmented than ever. And then there was secessionist and irredentist movements after the fall of the Yugoslavia. So can you just repeat the last part of your question? Because I agree about the analogy. I'm not sure where you...
The question is, how do you get there? I mean, it might be a possible solution. In other words, the Dayton Accords for Bosnia might have a Syrian sort of, replica. But the question is, how do you get to the point of producing some sort of confederation in Syria without the use of coercive force, as Clinton did, in order to get the various sides to compromise around a political plan?
Well, it is true that it calls for the defeat of Assad's regime. But if one go that far, one has to go to the next step right away. And the question is, who is filling the gap, and to what extent, and with which level of responsibility, which is what happened after Dayton. And it's not yet under the discussions with respect to Syria.
Did you want to answer? Did you want to jump in?
I was just going to make the point real quick. That would be the German analogy makes perfect sense. The only point that is missing from the German analogy is you're talking about a post-massive defeat. And the problem in Syria is no one is lost. And because no one is lost, I don't see where the will comes from.
But Tom?
Well, there's another problem with the German analogy, by which I'm totally unpersuaded. Germany was a country. Germany was a country long before 1945. Like, the Germans have had a sense of ethnic unity for hundreds of years. German unification occurred roughly in the middle of the 19th century. Syria isn't really a country. Syria was carved arbitrarily out of the side of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War. So you're talking about, just as if you're talking about a Marshall Plan for some place in Africa, let us say, which isn't really a country. Well, as a Marshall Plan for Europe, you had a huge infrastructure which had been destroyed, but you had societies, you had skills, you gave them the aid, and so you got the modern Europe. Syria is not Germany. There is simply no comparison. That's one problem. Could I just add a couple other points? We keep referring to France and Britain as great powers. France and Britain are not great powers. They have veto power in the Security Council, but they are piddling powers today. Turkey is a more powerful country. Probably Indonesia is a more powerful country than France and Britain. And multilateralism isn't three countries. Yes, literally it's multilateral, but realistically it's not multilateralism as we normally mean multilateralism. We should talk about real things. The world is as it is.
Okay, next question. Go ahead.
Can I answer this?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, you wanted to add something?
I completely agree with you, Tom. Germany is not Syria.
This is rare.
Well, but yeah, I really. Because
an epiphany.
Well, let's see how far you go with that epiphany. So here, World War II, post-World War II, civilized countries, 60, 70 million people died. Yeah. In Syria, only 5 million?
500,000.
500,000. I wonder which country as a part of the world is more civilized and more unified. Okay, so sorry, just a little bracket. With respect to great power, I do not suggest that having three countries like France and England and Russia, we are talking about multilateralism. It's impossible to talk about multilateralism these days. NATO has been just really punctures and suffering. We do not have multilateralism, and we don't have the mechanism of security that was developed after World War II because of two major powers who are actually creating and register a lot of veto veto power. But I would just say it's better than one country, and certainly with than having the United States under administrations of Trump to conduct a strike when we all know that if he had done that, it would be only in order to deflect his domestic problem at home. Now he's sort of like, I wouldn't say protected, he's directed. He's directing in his effort in a particular way. He's been, there was effort, it was called John Bolton, to actually even do more than just those limited strikes. He has been actually much more tempered as a result of that. So those efforts between Mattis to combine efforts with the great powers, all that is sort of like constraining him. And this is a good thing. Do we still agree?
I'm not sure what you're saying, actually.
Let's go to the next question. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for this valuable discussion. Until recently, the proxy of the United States was the multi-ethnic, secular, democratic SDF, until, that is, Eurasian comrades invaded their territory, northern Syria. So, they were organized around an autonomous region that aimed to be a model, a prototype for a future federal Syria. That was their official position, and they were successful to some extent. How's that for a starting point for a federal Syria? And why shouldn't the United States restore her support in all senses for the SDF and to hell with Turkey?
We continue to support the SDF. You may be confusing us with the Free Syrian Army. And the Free Syrian Army is a remnant of what it once was at the start of the Civil War. But the SDF is still a fairly coherent and united fighting group because it's made up largely of one ethnic group, the Kurds, who are looking at protecting their quadrant of northeastern Syria. And we continue to support them, although the president said last week that we would be withdrawing our forces from there. Most of the other forces have pretty much been, ones that we supported have been beaten or have just disbanded. What is left is the SDF and jihadist groups. And most of the jihadist groups now are coalesced in some are allies, some are not, in Idlib. And they're waiting for the big battle in Idlib. And it will be a big one. And as I indicated in my initial remarks, I have no doubt that at the right moment, Assad will use his chemical weapons again as necessary. I mean, there's fighting going on every day in Idlib right now. And it's not just the Syrians and the Russians and the Iranians, the Turks are there too. So the Syrian civil war is a long, long way from being over. Frankly, it's not so much a question, at least to me, of what Syria might look like. It's just how do you get all the parties to the table and simply stop the bloodletting. If you ask most Syrians, that's what they want most right now.
Last question.
So, I wish. So I will agree and see, Micheline, your first 2 points quite clearly. That it is refreshing and quite nice to see, limited though it may be, Britain, France, and the United States working together, and there is something to be said about having done nothing would have probably been worse. But it also occurs to me that this isn't a year or 2 years ago, and it seems like not only has the horse left the barn that we've in Damascus, it's already made it almost to the Turkish border. It seems as though, if you just look geographically on a map, other than the mess that is Idlib and the SDF enclaves which the Turks are trying to beat back and seem to be doing so reasonably successfully, what do we have? What can we look at? I'd like to think that I can imagine something far brighter, but I think Lewis may be unfortunately right in that it is sort of 73 all over again. I mean, I want to think otherwise, but how?
So in other words, Assad has conquered most of the territory that he lost since 2011, with the exceptions of the Kurdish Turkish border areas. Idlib province is the last remaining rebel, stronghold. It is 1973, to use Lewis's analogy. How do you, given that reality, where do we go from here? I mean, other than a full land invasion by NATO, which is not an option politically here in the West.
Practically speaking, I don't think we're going to do much at all, because I don't think it's in the heart of this president and his administration. If we had a different administration, there were many, many things we could do. I think, as several on the panel have mentioned, we have just simply unparalleled military force that we could bring to bear without necessarily introducing large numbers of ground forces. We have the U.S. Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. We could send 2 aircraft carriers. That would be 2 more than the Russians would probably want to dispatch, although they tried doing 1 and it didn't work out well. We could bring a lot more forces into Iraq. And we have tremendous convening power among our allies, both NATO, understanding that NATO is showing some frayed edges at the moment, but that's generally because of very poor leadership on the part of the United States. But many of our NATO allies, if not militarily, at least politically, would be on our side. And by the way, they are all the ones who have all the wealth that's going to be needed for the reconstruction of Syria. Neither Russia nor Iran has anywhere near the financial wherewithal to rebuild that country. Earlier question here, I think, Sammy, you had mentioned about the effects of the drought, which preceded the breakout of the Civil War by probably 5 or 6 years, and started this movement of folks from rural areas to the urban areas, which could have precipitated or at least heightened the chances for this kind of a conflict. Only the resources of the West can be brought to bear to address that. Otherwise, this will be a completely destroyed country. The Russians and the Iranians will not rebuild it. It'll take the Americans, the Europeans, and other Western countries, Japan, South Korea, to step up. You've got a lot of leverage. The forces that we've supported in northeastern Syria still control that quadrant. I think it's highly unlikely that as long as an American force is present, whether it's 2,000 or 20,000, they're going to be challenged by Syria, by Iran, or by Russia. They're just not. So there's a lot that we can do in that area. First of all, it's the area where the only oil Syria has. So you can develop that oil to the point that you can begin supporting the population, both the existing population and any new migrating population that goes to that area. Now, if Assad wants to negotiate a deal to start getting his economy back, he's got to have access to that oil. We got leverage to get him to the table and to talk. So I think we have a great deal of leverage. And I think Admiral Savagery, the former commander of Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, we basically went after these guys with a dart. That's it. There are a lot more things that we can do. We haven't even tapped into, that we know of, to our cyber capabilities in Syria. As I said before, we didn't go after their air defenses. We take out their air defenses, they are completely exposed to Israel. And the Iranians won't like that, nor will the Syrians, of course. The command and control is probably fairly primitive by Western standards. That could be very easily taken out by precision airstrikes by the same 3 countries and others who might join us, including Arab allies. And then finally, there's Assad and the leadership. Tom, your decapitation option. It's still out there. That's fairly dramatic. Probably wouldn't do that because we don't have a clear option for what would replace Assad. but the impetus ought to be to get all the relevant parties back to the table. And I continue to believe, and I will confess bias here, as a very proactivist former diplomat, it's only the United States who could do that. But to go back to your original question, that's not in the heart of this administration or its leadership.
Final comment.
We will watch Syria disintegrate.
Final comment to Tom?
We could attack the Iranians. That's an option. I mean, in the Iranians and their allies in Syria. And at the same time, if they respond in ways which are destructive to our interests, we could tell them that we are prepared to allow the Israelis to do what they want to do, which is to attack Iran directly. So I think that we can, the Iranians are still the most powerful force behind the Assad regime, and we could attack them. But for the Russians, I think if Lewis's assessment or statement or assumption of what the Clinton people thought about the Russians was correct, I think they're wrong. Or at least I think that assumption is too dangerous. Right out of law school, I found myself in the office of the Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a crisis that was never intended by either side. It was a crisis that came very close to nuclear war. The potential for escalation in a conflict, in a confrontation with the Russians is there. And the Russians still have several thousand nuclear warheads. It's not a risk that we can take because escalation scenarios are very difficult to control. Indeed, we're not sure we can control them. Because that was the learning of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Most people don't realize, unless you read the literature very closely, how close we came to war. I remember my boss, John McNaughton, who was McNamara's closest advisor, saying to me the night before the first Russian flagship, then Soviet flagship, was to cross the red line we had drawn out in the Atlantic Ocean. I'm going home tonight, he said, for the first time since the crisis began, because tomorrow may be war. So I think we don't want to test whether the Russians are bluffing. They have been investing very large amounts of money in the last 10 years in their military. They were very weak when Putin took over, but they are not as weak now, and they do retain their diverse nuclear capacity. That's very much a restraint on what we can do, or should do, in Iraq. The Iranians are a different question. We can attack them, we can hit them, and thus become actors, which we are not. And so I think everyone agrees that in order to move beyond the status quo, we have to be prepared to use more violence. And we have to ask ourselves whether we're prepared to do that, and whether, finally, that's in the U.S. interest.
Great. Thank you, Tom, Micheline, Gary, Lewis. Thank you to the audience. We were supposed to end it earlier.